solid. Annie, are we ready? Where's Art? There's Art. What's that? They just dropped them on you this morning, if you're talking about your people.
They were.
And I got up to 163, the highest RC that I just used. I just put it in my thing. I looked at them all and I said, where's the language? And I have.
Get the ones.
I haven't got any.
Which one is from this?
Huh?
Which one is from this?
I just gave her mine.
Okay. Do you want, we probably have an extra that you want to put.
We'll wait till we get that straightened out.
She's got them now.
Oh, does she?
I just
Okay.
gave her mine.
Okay.
We do. Yeah.
Well, I presume you read your own and Mike's, right?
I have not read Mike's. I have not had the opportunity.
We're in at ease, waiting for the newest RCs to be distributed. Apparently, people waited till after yesterday to submit them, so we will wait till they're distributed and go.
Huh? There are some public submissions that came in after the postings last night, so.
Well, just to take advantage of this unanticipated break. Obviously, the time of the meeting is dwindling down, and we still have a whole lot of proposals that have to be considered by the board. I'd like each board member to think about how to either streamline the process going forward or expanding the hours upon which we meet, and let me know your thoughts, and we'll try and cobble something together going forward. Annie, you ready?
Logs.
You want to do the thing first? Okay. We've got the RCs now distributed, and we'll resume in session with a few preliminary matters, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We finally have almost the entire board around one table. We do still have Mr. Carpenter online, but welcome back, Jared. Good to see you. We did get a little something for you. Didn't have wrapping paper, so it's wrapped in RCs. Please. Please, open it.
Go ahead and open it. Go ahead and open it, and probably the audience would like to share it with you.
Urban Cowboy.
Yeehaw.
Thank you.
And I'm going to turn it over to the Department of Law, who has a few preliminary remarks and guidelines for the board. Noah?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to take this occasion to remind the full slate of board members that there are certain policies that are good to reference during the deliberative process in order to build the record. I think this morning the ones that are particularly germane would be the allocation criteria as well as the sustainable salmon fisheries policy. And so if you're a member who's looking to pass a particular proposal before the board, it is especially important that you reference those policies and why they support your decision on the record. And if you're a member who's voting against a proposal, you should also cite to those policies if they form the basis for your opposition. I at least have them all in this little blue-bound book. If it makes it easier, the second policy is the allocation criteria, and the the third and fourth give you some breakdown of the sustainable salmon fisheries policy, which might make it easier when you're referring to it on the record. Thank you.
And this little blue book you're referencing has been given to all board members, so you just, pardon me?
It's the frequently used policies, but we've got some other copies of it over there at the end of the table.
And the last thing I'd like Department of Law to address is the question that's been raised with OEG in either one of the 169 or 170 as to whether that would need to be repealed, left intact, or whatnot on either one of those two proposals.
Sure, through the chair, and I think as we debate those proposals specifically, I can chime in to provide clearer instruction as needed. The more specific regulation will supersede the general, so if this board adopts a stock of concern action plan, that will give the intent and provide the regulatory language for the department to manage to. Depending on what language the board chooses to adopt, there are other sustainable salmon policy considerations in OEG. If it exists in the action plan, is the primary management objective, and so it ought to be treated as such in the regulation. If I feel that an OEG is being used in a way that is different than the way it is defined in the sustainable salmon policies, I will enter that thought onto the record at that point, but I don't think we need to get into that now in the abstract.
Thank you so very much. And with that, yes, Commissioner.
So I just want to make it perfectly clear. So the action plan would, in essence, suspend the OEG even though it was still on the books, is my understanding, because they're, just like any of these other regulations involving set net fishery, this would be the defining action moving forward. So it wouldn't have to necessarily be repealed, it would just be suspended during the duration of the action plan.
Through the chair to the commissioner, that is correct. The board does not need to rescind the OEG in passing the more specific action plan. Yes.
Thank you.
So with that advice, we'll proceed, and we'll need a vehicle to proceed with. Ms. Carlson Van Dort.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would offer up, or I move RC, the language found in RC 169 to be considered by the board for language to encompass an action plan to address the stock of concern designation that the board has placed on the Kenai River Late Run King Salmon.
I second that.
Okay, we have in front of us RC 169 as the action plan. Any board discussion? Ms. Carlson Van Dort.
I can walk the board through what my intention was with my RC, and if it's helpful, I might be able to point out a couple of places where I differ from Mr. Ward's RC as well, if that's helpful. And then I'll place some comments on the record, and we can go from there. Is that okay?
That would be great.
Okay, wonderful. So on page number 1, in the Kenai River Late Run King Salmon Stock of Concern Action Plan, the recovery goal, so both of these RCs establish an explicit recovery goal for the department to manage to, which is within the range of 15 to 30,000 king salmon, 75 centimeters mid-eye to tail fork, and that's later described. It also notes that achieving the lower end of the Kenai River Late Run salmon recovery goal shall take priority over not exceeding the upper end of the escapement and in-river goals for the Kenai and Kasilof River sockeye salmon explicitly. Again, both of these, the language is identical between me and Mr. Wood's language found in RC 170. Further, it goes on to explain how the department should consider delisting criteria. Essentially, what that would do is that until the recovery goal is achieved or exceeded for 3 consecutive years, one of which is at or above 18,000 fish, which is the estimated number of spawners needed for maximum sustained yield, and is expected to achieve the goal in future years, or is achieved 4 of 6 consecutive years, one of which meets that 18,000 SMSY threshold, and the goal is expected to be achieved in future years, the Kenai River Late Run King Salmon will remain a stock of concern until the department recommends delisting to the Board of Fisheries at a meeting. That is not necessarily an Upper Cook Inlet meeting, it could be a special meeting, so we didn't bind in that way. And Mr. Wood and my language is the same. However, right below that in section, the next section, in section C, is different. In my language, I inserted a section that speaks directly to how the department should achieve the recovery goal with respect to both the sport and commercial fisheries, as well as many of the others, the personal use fisheries as well. So the primary difference is that I've inserted some latitude for the department to consider, as long as they are within the recovery goal, to liberalize a bit of sport fishing within that recovery goal. So you can go from either complete prohibition, which is what the priority of the recovery goal or the sport fishery will be, to catch and release or retention of king salmon less than 34 inches. I have not made explicit what the threshold for the department to manage this is. I would allow the department to have some latitude in how they would evaluate whether or not it's appropriate to liberalize the sport fishery within the recovery goal to allow for a harvest of a king salmon less than 34 inches. But my recommendation or my intent would be that it's certainly within the recovery goal, and that I would, again, recommend to the department that they are either at or have exceeded that SMSY recovery goal sooner than later before they consider any liberalization. If that makes sense, Mr. Chair. Okay. Moving on, it also explicitly states that the Kenai River is closed to sport fishing for king salmon, that a king salmon that's caught must be released immediately. And from July 1 through August 15th, a person may not use more than one single unbaited artificial lure in the Kenai River from ADF and G marker located at the outlet of Skilac Lake. The bag limit for Kenai sockeye salmon is different than what is currently in reg. It is 6 per day, 12 in possession, so that is a change, but it is consistent in both mine and Mr. Wood's language. Walking through this, the portions in three, or A, B, C, D, E, F, 4 is currently in regulation. That's not changed, but we just incorporated into it so that it's a comprehensive action plan. In the sport fisheries, in the salt waters of Cook Inlet north of the latitude of Bluff Point, they are closed to a taking of king salmon. In the central drift fishery, the commercial drift net fishery in the central district is closed within 2 miles of the Kenai Peninsula shoreline. So that is a change from current regulation. I think it was 1 mile and 1.5 miles. Anyways, it's a bit of an increase in the distance, but that language is consistent between Mr. Woods and my language. When speaking about the commercial fishery, in the upper sub-district of the Central District set gillnet fishery, much of this language was borrowed from KPFA's RC 96 with some changes. First of all, in this language, we account from June 20th to June 30th, when the preseason forecast, including harvest and forecast error of king salmon, 75 centimeters mid-eye to tail fork and longer, is greater than 15,000 fish. The upper sub-district set gillnet fishery may be opened as follows. So the two significant changes there are, one, the inclusion of incorporating or accounting for the harvest and forecasting error, and that number is set at 15,000 large fish in mine. It's a different number in Mr. Woods. It's 14,250 in his. And that, in my language, it allows the department some latitude. It is not a shall, it is a may. And that is consistent change throughout Mr. Wood and my language. Retention of a king salmon is required to be made available to the department for sampling. Each set permit holder may use up to 1 set gill net that is not more than 35 fathoms in length and 29 meshes deep. And for the June 20th to June 30th periods, no more than 2 8-hour periods will be allowed, with a 48-hour continuous closure beginning between 7 p.m. Thursday and 7 a.m. Friday. So that is another change from the KPFA language. I believe they had initially requested 36 hours. The department is currently managing to 48 and has for a while. And so both Mr. Wood and I incorporated 48 hours for consistency and regulation. And then paragraph E talks about sort of the rolling tide openers around the high water. Around high water, that was consistent with a lot of the discussion that we heard on the record. From July 15th through July 27th, when the in-season projection, including harvest and projection forecast errors accounted for of large king salmon larger than 75 centimeters and greater than 15,000 fish, the upper sub-district set gill net fishery may open as follows. And again, that's very similar. Retention is required. 1 set gill net, no more than 35 fathoms in length and 29 meshes deep. However, for the period between July 15th and July 27th, both of the RCs allow for 4 8-hour periods, again with a 48-hour continuous closure per week beginning Thursday night and Friday morning. Again, the rolling openers around high water are accounted for in this section as well. Similarly, for July 28th and August 15th, when the in-season projection accounting for anticipated harvest and forecast error and in-season run strength of large king salmon greater than 15,000 fish, the upper sub-district set gill net fishery may be opened, again with those same provisions. So the big differences between what KPFA requested is that there is a reduction from 3 to 1 period in the June portion of the fishery. 15,000 fish is required, and then in the July and late July time stratas, we require that the department also incorporate in-season projection to determine whether or not they will open fishing periods. Moving along to page 4, I think the other Yeah, it's stated that the intent, again, will be based on the Sedalia District tide tables by section. So that's incorporated, again, to account for those sort of differentials in the tide timing between the lower southern end and the upper end of the upper sub-districts at Gillnet Commercial Fisheries. And then section 4, I believe, is a little bit different, just with, I guess, some semantics, where the upper sub-districts at Gillnet Commercial Fishery, notwithstanding the provisions of 5A.AC 21-359, 5A.AC 21-365, and 5A.AC 21-360, C1B, 2B, 3B. The commercial fishing periods will be based on the abundance of sockeye salmon returning to the Kenai River. So notwithstanding, I think what is currently the late-run king salmon management plan, the Kasilof sockeye management plan, and perhaps the Kenai sockeye management plan, this action plan supersedes that. One other difference between mine and Mr. Woods is that all commercially harvested king salmon must be delivered to a licensed processor. So the idea is that those king salmon that must be retained will be delivered to a processor, and then the department can sample those king salmon at the processor. And then lastly, we talk about the personal use fisheries, and it says in the Kenai and Kasilof personal use fisheries in the Kenai River, but it should read in the Kenai and Kasilof River personal use fisheries, retention of king salmon is prohibited. And then in the Kasilof River, personal use set gill net may not exceed 10 fathoms. There's some mesh size provisions and 29 meshes in depth. And then both Mr. Wood and I have language at the end here that concludes with saying that to the extent practicable, the department will conduct habitat assessments on a schedule that conforms to the Board of Fisheries triennial meeting cycle, and the department is requested to report those findings to the board and submit proposals to the board for appropriate modification of the plan. This is a recognition that we cannot compel the department to appropriate funds for this, but it is a recommendation or a request that the department consider that in the action plan. Mr. Chair, I think that covers most of the changes, and I can try and address some of the questions, or if any, that might arise between what I'm trying to do with RC 169 and what Mr. Wood might be proposing in 170. There's subtle differences, but there are some that are significant and probably should be considered carefully by the board. And I can either take questions or I can give some thoughts about why I think this is the way to go.
I just want you to clarify one thing for me. Your closing comments on page 4 dealing with subparagraph J. You said it should read in the Kenai and Kasilof personal use fisheries. That's how my version does read.
Well, there's been multiple versions, Mr. Chair, that have been developed over the past while, and it should read Kasilof River. I think it was just an omission, and if this is accepted, I think it needs to be just amended, or I can get the intent, however law or reg is comfortable with, but the intention is not to exclude the prohibition of retention of king salmon in the Kasilof River.
Yeah, the amendment would be simple, I agree.
It'd be
with
very
you.
simple.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure that we clarify and get it done the manner in which you intended. And do you need to put an amendment on the floor?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'd like to amend, I move to amend RC 169 in, oh boy, at the end, page 4, J1, it should read, in the Kenai River and Kasilof River personal use fisheries, Mr. Chair.
Is there a second?
Second.
And is there a request for unanimous consent?
And I request unanimous consent.
Any objection? Okay, seeing none, that amendment passes. Mr. Nelson?
I guess I just had a clarification. You're intending in J1 that's the dip net fisheries, because we also have the set gill net fisheries.
That's correct. There are no
that's
set
next.
gill net personal use fisheries in the Kenai River, and so that's covered in the with the Kasilof language. But I wanted to make sure that we prohibited retention of king salmon in both the Kenai and the Kasilof personal use fisheries, dip net fisheries.
And now I'll get to your question to me, whether I wish you to proceed with discussing why you did what you did and your reason behind it. And I hope you'd also address what Law brought up with the two policies that might be involved.
You mean with respect to the current OEG?
No, in respect to the allocation and the sustainable salmon policy. You have the floor.
Mr. Chair, so appreciate the latitude. Thank you for letting me put my thoughts on the record, and I'll try and do it as cohesively as possible. The purpose of 169, in my mind, is to recover to a sustained yield. And sustained yield means to me that we will provide the stewardship needed to keep replenishable resources available at the highest possible level. And that is rooted in Alaska's Constitution, Article 8. The data that has been presented at this meeting through written and oral reports given by the department, traditional knowledge testimony to some extent, PCs and RCs, all indicates that the low end of the current SEG under recent poor productivity conditions does not and will not achieve the objective of sustained yield. I have heard from the department at this meeting and at previous meetings within this cycle that raising the goal of an SEG is a proactive measure to improve productivity, specifically within the range and close to the midpoint. And that is what is under consideration in this action plan. That is precisely what 169 is intended to do. To set a recovery goal range within 15 to 30,000 with an emphasis on reaching sustained maximum yield to try and optimize the potential for recovery of the Kenai River late run king salmon. The 15,000 number that has been and likely will be much debated is to minimize regulatory confusion and to make clear, much like the intent of the optimum escapement goal set by the board 4 years ago, to provide a reasonable threshold to balance the recovery goals of king salmon with providing harvest opportunity for sockeye based on sockeye abundance. And that this RC provides restrictions for every user group below and above that 15,000 threshold. It provides restrictions to the in-river sport fishermen, the set gillnet fishermen, the drift gillnet fishermen, and personal use fishermen, personal use Alaskans, until that recovery goal is achieved. And to speak to, specifically to the sustained, the policy for sustainable salmon fisheries, there's a couple that I think are applied, and it sets out that the formulary for fishery management plans designed to achieve maximum or optimum salmon production, the board must consider factors including environmental change, habitat loss and degradation, data uncertainty, limited funding for research and management programs, existing harvest patterns, and new fisheries or expanding fisheries. I think that over the course of this meeting, we have heard about essentially all of those things. Further, in the sustainable management policy for salmon fisheries, wild salmon stocks and salmon habitat should be maintained at levels of resource productivity that assure sustained yield, and that depleted salmon stocks should be allowed to recover where appropriate, should be actively restored, and diversity should be maintained to the maximum extent possible at the genetic population, species, and ecosystem levels. It also stipulates that salmon fisheries shall be managed to allow escapements within ranges necessary to conserve and sustain potential salmon production and to maintain normal ecosystem functioning. And that is precisely, I think, part of what is the action plan proposed is trying to address. Also within that section, salmon escapement goals, whether sustainable escapement goals, biological escapement goals, optimum escapement goals, in-river goals, should be established in a manner consistent with sustained yield. Unless otherwise directed, the department will manage Alaska salmon fisheries to the extent possible for maximum sustained yield. And that's what we're trying to do with the 15,000 threshold in this action plan. And the ways to do that, per the policy, is to consider impacts of fishing, including incidental mortality and other human-induced mortality, which should be assessed and considered in harvest management decisions. That is also incorporated in this action plan, and controlling human-induced sources of fishing mortality should incorporate procedures to assure effective monitoring, compliance, control, and enforcement. And again, all of those elements, I think, are included in this action plan. With respect to the allocation criteria, I will say that if the department, in trying to reach their so within the allocation criteria, I think the allocation is fairly balanced for the king salmon. Because, and that's what we're targeting here within the action plan. Because I'm not stipulating any shalls necessarily, the department may, allow for these fisheries to occur both within the sport fishery and within the commercial fishery. However, I think if we consider going below that 15,000 threshold and mandating that the department open a commercial fishery while the in-river users are closed, that is a very significant allocation, and anybody that would be advocating for that position should definitely go through the allocation criteria associated with that. But right now, as this action plan is drafted, at least my intention is to have the pain felt by all with respect to how we achieve recovery for late-run king salmon, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you. I can only give you some assurance that I'm feeling the pain if they aren't. I have a couple of questions. I want to clarify some of the verbiage that's used in both yours and the other RC. In all of the time periods, you have that retention of king salmon is required to be made available to the department for sampling. Yet in yours, as you pointed out, on page 4, it says all commercial harvested king salmon must be delivered to a licensed processor. Which are binding, which are controlling?
Both. They need to be retained and delivered to a processor.
So the sampling wouldn't be taking place until it got to the processor? Is that what you're saying?
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Okay. And I put them side by side last night, and I will say that she has not only accurately defined the differences, but the total, complete disclosure of them, and I appreciate that. And I do have another question just on what it means. And on page 1, on your subparagraph C that's in yours but not in the other one, I'm not understanding what the R is in number 1, because it seems to be contradictory. So could you once again go through what your intent was on that paragraph, subparagraph C?
Yes, Mr. Chair. So B is essentially a catch and release fishery. And that's not prohibited under the tenant, the fundamental underlying requirements of the action plan, because fishing for king salmon is closed. It is not a catch and release. You can't try and target them with specific gear or lures. You cannot catch a king salmon. You cannot target a king salmon. However, A allows the department to potentially allow for a harvest of a king salmon beneath the 34-inch threshold or the 75-centimeter threshold if the department feels that they are going to be able to meet the requirements set out in sections A and B for the recovery goals and being able to hit one of those MSY years. So if there is, and like I said to the department, my intention is that I would manage for that SMSY sooner than later and try and hit that target and then shoot for between the recovery goal for the subsequent years in order to delist. But if they are, seeing a great return and they're allowing that retention or allowing the commercial fishery to be prosecuted, then they may consider allowing the average sport fisherman, John Q. sport fisherman, an opportunity to retain a small king salmon within the river. That is, again, at the department's discretion. I was not going to provide a threshold for that, but it was just an opportunity for a consideration by the department to allow a little bit of opportunity on a sub 34-inch king salmon for somebody to retain and take home and eat if they would like to, Mr. Chair.
And my last question, just for my education and what this does or doesn't do, there's a period of time from June 30th until July 15th. It's not accounted for in your scenarios. Now, in one of the early RCs that we received from the set netters, they had that as a specific break. Is that what your intent is by not addressing that time frame here?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that was taken directly from the KPFA RC 96.
Okay, I have no other questions of the maker of the motion. Any other members that like to have Ms. Carlson-Vendart further explain? Mr. Survey?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I'd like you to go over the difference between a forecast error and a projection error.
Good catch.
There what?
Good catch.
Oh,
There is no difference. There was what the difference was is a word edit that was recommended by the Sport Fishery Division. It made it into some of the edits, but not all of them. So within 169, I think the first time period talks about a projection or a forecast error. The subsequent time periods talk about a projection error. They're one and the same. And my intention is that if this were adopted and the regulation was cleaned up, that those would be made to be conforming using the word forecast.
thank you.
Any other member need clarification as to what this proposal does or what the proposer intended this proposal to do?
I have a question.
Mr. Carpenter?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Ms. Carlson-Van Dort, appreciate all the work you put into this. Also, both Mr. Woods, the effort that they put in with their language as well and their RCs. A couple questions. I guess the first question, I'm just trying to figure out, a big part of this conversation for the last week has been, obviously, how do we conserve and put more kings on the spawning grounds? And one of the things that we heard during the report, the study that was done last summer by Mr. Hollier and, the team that was hired to help him do that, was there was some success that took place in regards to releasing live kings in the set net fishery. And when I read this, apparently to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this does not appear to me to have a mechanism to allow a set netter that's closely attending his net when the weather is nice, that sees a king that's very easily released, to do that. They have to retain it, and then they have to turn it into a processor. Am I reading that correctly, or am I not?
I think that's a good question, Mr. Carpenter, and that was language that was taken from Mr. Woods' RC. He might have, my original language had the word caught in there. And my intention with the original language was that if it came in the boat, then it was caught and it had to be retained. But I was comfortable with retaining what might be considered viable or, energetic live kings. So maybe Mr. Wood could speak Mr. Mike Wood could speak specifically to why he had that language in his, in the exercise of kind of trying to mesh our two RCs or our two approaches as closely as possible. That was one of the changes that was made to my RC that was different than what I had originally proposed, but it's a good question, and I don't know if Mr. Wood had some thoughts on that.
And I'm hoping he does. Do you?
Oh, yeah. So thanks for asking, and also I really appreciate the explanation you gave about this, how this plan is laid out, because I could not have explained it that well. It's very accurate. And I also would like to throw kudos out to the fact that this wouldn't even be a proposal if it weren't for the department helping me draft this, so, and on both sides. So that's what we're looking at, is a direct involvement with the department to have what we're looking at here. In terms of what to do with a king, it was my intent in this stock of concern plan, so for however long this lasts, that a king salmon will not be retained in the set gillnet fishery. Will not. And if it can be released unharmed due to all the criteria that we've heard, that would be excellent. I don't know exactly what that is, but if it's a live, viable fish, it should keep swimming. If it's a fish that's bleeding or meets the criteria for continued to be harvested, then it should come in the boat, preferably gills ripped, and then delivered to the processor or department for sampling. I would like to take that one step further, but I don't think the department has any way to deal with this. And I'd be curious, I think it should go to the food bank or something to that effect in this 3-year plan. But that might be out of the range of the department. And the reason for this is I also feel that under this plan, when there are these restrictions, neither a set netter nor a set netter shouldn't profit from a king salmon, whether it's in home pack or financially.
Does that answer your question, Mr.
Yeah,
Carpenter?
it does answer my question, and I have a little bit of concern about this. And I'll tell you why, is I want every king salmon, if we're gonna go through the motions of spending 10 days creating this plan, and all the effort that everybody, from the department to the public, to everybody else, if we cannot take and put a little faith in humanity to release a king salmon that is a very viable fish, especially a big one, and let it go, I don't know what the point that we continue to sit here for is. So I think that part of this proposal or Mr. Wood's proposal, however things shake out, needs to be clarified for me in regards to that, because I think they should have the ability to release those fish. If I could just ask one more question, then I'll let somebody else answer, because I have quite a few.
Proceed.
The second question that I had is in regards to, this is more of a question maybe for the department, in regards to,
Can I,
know,
Mr. Carpenter, can I interrupt you for 1 second? What I'd like to do is get any board questions for the makers of the
Okay.
2 RCs to clarify what the RCs do, and then we'll go into individuals. Would that be?
Okay, then I'll ask one question that I believe is directed to Ms. Carlson Mendort. So one of the things that I heard, and you laid this out very well, very eloquently. The one thing that I didn't hear mentioned, in this plan, there's burden put on the saltwater sport, there's burden put on the central district set net fishermen, there's burden put on the personal use fishermen in the Kasilof, and in the Kenai, and there's burden put on the sport fishermen in the Kenai. But there's one group of mysterious people that are going to be fishing in the EEZ this summer. The state has zero control over, that we know have an impact to the final escapement of the Kenai River late run king salmon. And that's the drift fishermen. And this was one of the concerns I had coming into this meeting, is that all the focus is really being put on one major commercial entity in this particular situation. And when we look at how the projections are supposed to be made in season about how the department is supposed to use its preseason information, and we got this mysterious fishery going on in the EEZ where we still have no idea what the rules are going to be, what their retention is supposed to be for king salmon. All of that information is probably going to be delayed. When it does come in, we don't know how it's going to be verified quantifiably. There's all kinds of things to do there. So I guess my question is, when you wrote this and when you considered the 15,000 being the number as the pretty much the buy-in number to come in and open some of these fisheries, how did you take those king salmon numbers that are going to be harvested into account?
Ms. Carlson-Vendor, do you wish to respond?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, Member Carpenter, about, being able to roll viable or healthy-ish king salmon out of a gill net, ones that are thrashing, I have no problem with that, and I think that that's appropriate, frankly, and if we need to have, some conforming, or if the intent is clear, we can craft some language around that. I think it's a very simple, probably word change, but, my intention with that is that if that king salmon hits the boat, is removed from the water, or is severely injured or is already dead, it needs to be retained. So if you're removing it from the water, or it's visibly very injured or is already dead in that net before it comes out of the water, it needs to be retained. If a fisherman can, effectively roll a king salmon out of its net and it swims away and it never gets out, never leaves the water, I think that's appropriate. And I don't know if that answers the first question that you had. With respect to the drift fishery, it was very difficult to affect meaningful change in the drift fishery with respect to kings. The way I chose to get at it in this RC was to expand the closed waters around the mouths of the river. So I believe I think the boundaries are, and staff can correct me, is it 1/2 mile and then south and 1 mile north, or vice versa? Yeah, it's 1/2 mile south and 1.5 miles north of the mouths of the river. I've expanded both sides.
Would someone start drafting that now so that the stand-down time is minimized? Ms. Carlson-Vendor.
The other thing that I forgot to mention that might also address a little bit of Member Carpenter's question in that is that in both versions, the Kenai River Special Harvest Area is closed to commercial fishing. And I know.
Seal Off River.
Oh, I'm sorry, thank you, the Seal Off River Special Harvest Area is closed to commercial fishing. I know that sometimes gets utilized when it's open. I don't think it's open very frequently by drift fishermen. I don't